Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're doing something a little different. We are undertaking an institutional stress test.
Right.
We're reaching back into the archives, specifically a 12-month slice of American media history from the year 1940.
And we're going to analyze how a system, a whole media structure, responds to strain.
That's it. This isn't about nostalgia.
No, not at all. We are not interested in the history of 1940. We are interested in its structure. Our source material today is a series of excerpts from the New Yorker magazine spanning January to December of that year.
And what a year. It gives us this incredible snapshot of, well, affluent metropolitan American life right before the global crisis fully consumed it.
Exactly. It's a system under pressure, but a system determined to maintain normalcy.
So our mission today is to use these archival documents as a critical mirror for our own time, for 2026.
We're adopting a cold analytical lens here.
Yes, very much so. Prioritizing the foundational structures, the incentives driving the power brokers, and the systemic risks that were either embraced or, more often, systemically ignored.
So the goal is to identify points of structural repetition, things that are applicable to you today, the learner, as you navigate a world that is, frankly, just as saturated with contradictory information.
We're really looking at the foundational logic, aren't we? How is economic life, how is daily life maintained and normalized when the world outside was visibly collapsing?
What were the mechanisms of psychological and institutional preservation? That's the core tension we're testing. How the focus on, say, consumption and really localized concerns was structurally sustained.
While the very foundation supporting that comfort geopolitical stability was just, well, visibly crumbling everywhere else.
Let's dig in.
Okay, so when you first open these issues of The New Yorker from 1940, what's the first thing that hits you?
The sheer dominance of status and leisure. It's not just a theme, you're right. It is the structural core of the entire publication.
Right. It's not a guide to international affairs, even though that's the backdrop to everything. It's a comprehensive guide to being well-informed about high-end comfort.
And social performance. Let's call it what it is. This is the consumption imperative, and it's so important to recognize its structural purpose. For a magazine like this to even exist, let alone thrive,
its primary function had to be the maintenance and really the detailed mapping of social and economic status.
of course, advertising revenue, which is what dictates the viability of the whole enterprise, required that the reader believe the most urgent decisions they faced involved where they were seen dining.
And what car they were driving.
Absolutely. The detailed listings for dinner, supper, and dancing aren't just suggestions. They are mandates for social navigation.
They really are. They're so specific. At places like the Trine Room in the Assassin, you're explicitly told you have to dress if you want to dance after 10 p.m.
It's a code. These aren't just details about a fun night out. They constitute a detailed map of required social status performance. You have to adhere to these institutionalized class codes.
And that performance, that mandatory performance, maps directly onto the ads.
Directly. It maps onto what we could call the microstructure of the self. The advertisements define success not just as, ownership, but as specific, quantifiable status acquisition.
Like the Studebaker Land Cruiser. It's not just a car.
No, it's explicitly marketed as a favorite with the smart younger set. They're selling a tribal identity through a piece of machinery.
And then you contrast that with the DeSoto.
A completely different angle. It's fascinating. The DeSoto ad doesn't just say it's a good car. It boasts a 100-horsepower engine, 122.25-inch wheelbase, sealed beam headlights. It's all about the technical specs.
But even with all that technical talk, they anchor it with a key piece of consumer information.
Which is that it's priced lower than last year.
Exactly. So the incentive is constantly renewed status acquisition, but it's benchmarked by these specific technical upgrades and a sense of financial efficiency.
It's an economic mandate disguised as personal desire, and the luxury retail sector just confirms this over and over.
We see B. Altman & Co. selling rayon crepe evening gowns for $35.
Which was a significant amount of money then.
And then the Jekyll Budget Shop offers fur coats ranging from $45 all the way up to $500.
And that wide financial spread is so important. It reinforces the institutional narrative that aspiration, the pursuit of status, is accessible. It's actively supported by a robust domestic retail economy. There's a rung on the ladder for you.
And this is where it gets really interesting for me. The institutional incentive wasn't just to sell clothes or cars.
No.
It was to normalize domestic stability by making personal change the most urgent subject.
Yes, that is the core mechanism. You see Helena Rubinstein's classic case lipsticks.
Or Dorothy Gray's personality styling courses. They offered individual and class instruction on posture, diction, and clothes.
Think about the function of that, the incredibly deep coverage of cosmetic and fashion shifts, like the shift from a molded fit to bulky pleated skirts by designers like Alex and Piguet.
It elevated personal consumption to a subject as complex and worthy of analysis as the military machinations unfolding in Europe.
It absolutely did. If your primary focus is whether your skirt should be pleated or molded, your anxiety is channeled toward a solvable problem. It's channeled toward cosmetic self-improvement, which fuels the economy.
Rather than toward systemic geopolitical risks, which would shut that economy right down.
So the structural core of the magazine was to ensure that consumption mandate remained central. It was the engine of revenue, and it normalized domestic stability. It defined the reader's primary engagement with the world as acquiring status and comfort.
Okay, so now let's contrast that hyper-focus on comfortable details with the actual domestic risks that the media did acknowledge.
Because they did acknowledge them.
They did, but there's this curious mechanism of risk containment. You see localized risks immediately neutralized by systemic reassurance.
The January 1940 reference to the water shortage, the drought new style, is a perfect example.
It is. The article acknowledges that reserves were lower than they had been for 13 years. That's a serious technical reality.
But the danger is instantly tempered. It's acknowledged, and then it's immediately downgraded.
The risk of skipping a morning bath is called actually remote.
Right, because the city still held 283,849,000,000 gallons, enough water for 4 months without any replenishment. The institutional response is so clear. Acknowledge the risk, the drought.
But immediately affirm the competence of the institution, in this case the Department of Water Supply, by using these vast, almost unimaginable, reassuring numbers.
The threat is framed as a manageable inconvenience. It's not a systemic failure requiring panic or, God forbid, structural questioning.
And we see that same containment mechanism applied to political threats. The mention of a domestic extremism plot.
The soup can bombs.
Yes, blowing up congressmen with soup can bombs. It's described as having a preposterous air. The text itself seems to struggle to visualize catastrophe taking shape on a public rifle range in America.
Because catastrophe for the insulated American of 1940 was difficult to visualize domestically. The system was engineered to frame it as clumsy or foreign or just silly.
Right. The media apparatus processed these potential domestic threats as amateurish, farcical failures.
Which only reinforces the perception of a robust systemic integrity at home.
But globally, the news is relentless and catastrophic. The London Blitz creating complete exhaustion, Paris being hateful under German occupation.
And here's the structural constraint we absolutely must recognize. The media structure process these events as distant, often third-person reports. They are separated by hundreds of column inches from the reader's immediate reality.
The reality of purchasing Steinway records or choosing their A.1 sauce cocktail.
The media had a built-in limitation. It could only treat these global catastrophes as news items, as spectacle, not as urgent foundational calls to action that might affect the reader's daily life or consumption habits.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, the key insight here is that the 1940 media apparatus was structurally compelled to prioritize localized, manageable risks.
And a hyper-detailed consumption cycles.
And in doing so, it effectively ignored the systemic, non-local, geopolitical, and technological risks that were already determining the future.
Precisely. The system is designed to keep the consumer productively engaged in the solvable micro-problems. Do I have enough water for my bath? Which lipstick color is in fashion?
So they don't look up.
So they don't look up and question the viability of the whole edifice that funds the publication in the first place. When you see today's media hyper-focus on highly localized, manageable problems, you have to ask yourself, what massive systemic risk are they encouraging you to ignore? So to understand how this narrative of stable comfort was maintained, we really have to look at the institutions of power and the economic incentives that drove them to shape public perception.
And one of the most critical developments, one that feels incredibly resonant in 2026, is the institutionalization of public opinion itself.
Yes, via Dr. George Gallup.
The American Institute of Public Opinion started in 1935. Now, this sounds like straightforward social science, but the source material points out the architectural logic, and that tells a deeper story about the marketization of trust.
It is absolutely crucial. Gallup's organization is explicitly called a non-charitable, profit-making organization.
Right there in the text.
Yet it strategically adopts the language and the visual shorthand of neutral public service institutions. It uses the dignified term institute, which was a fashion among businessmen at the time.
And its trademark is the Capitol Dome.
So the core incentive is marketability, right? By applying this veneer of institutional authority and patriotic imagery, Gallup transforms subjective, messy political discourse
Into a clean, sellable metric, a poll result.
Public opinion stops being a political process and starts being a quantifiable commodity that can be purchased and analyzed.
And this profit-making dynamic immediately introduces bias.
Of course. Gallup himself came directly from the world of advertising at Young and Rubicam. The source even notes his cubicle was strategically numbered 14, skipping 13.
Which is such a telling detail.
It illustrates this blend of quantitative analysis and market superstition that's necessary to sell data. And polling data primarily benefits those institutions who can afford to purchase or influence that data. It transforms trust into a proprietary business model from day one.
And that structural framework, simplifying complex reality into a marketable metric, it extends directly into politics. The political narrative is clearly optimized for sale.
It relies heavily on personality over deep policy or structural critique.
Take the coverage of the Republican candidate, Wendell Willkie.
Right. He was a corporate man, a public utilities magnate. He was backed by giants like Commonwealth and Southern and J.P. Morgan Company.
But the serious structural power he represented it's buried.
It's completely buried. Instead, the coverage focuses almost entirely on his personal habits.
He loves poker, hates horses.
Hankers for literary society and relies on his journalist connections. He is packaged and sold as a charming, romantic artist of the old-fashioned type, who's even interested in nonconformism like Norman Thomas.
So the institutional incentive here is selling a political figure. And to do that, you have to simplify.
You bypass any sustained critique of the actual corporate structures and power dynamics that produced him. You rely on personal charm to make the complex and possibly unpopular power acceptable and emotionally consumable to the public.
And that logic, that prioritizing of presentation over substance, it also holds true for cultural institutions, like the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
The Met provides a perfect microcosm of how centralized wealth defines institutional governance and cultural preservation.
The collections are fundamentally defined by massive bequests from names we still know today, Altman, Marquand, Friedsam, Morgan.
And they dictated what was preserved. We learned that the early museum committee had this huge debate over whether the institution should be run by men of art culture. So artists focused on aesthetics.
Versus non-voluptuaries. What a great term.
Isn't it? Meaning conservative financial stewards focused on capital preservation.
That tension between aesthetic merit and maximizing capital is fascinating. It shows the core institutional conflict right there.
And you even see the curator's task described as having to combine honesty and tact nicely when writing bulletins about often questionable gifts.
So the institutional mandate was primarily managerial and diplomatic. It was centered on preserving wealth and maximizing future bequests, sometimes over pure artistic merit.
And we also see the very transactional nature of state funding through the Works Progress Administration, the WPA.
Which pumped an enormous amount of federal money into New York City.
$827 million since 1935. A massive stimulus.
But the source notes the abrupt firing of 80 WPA writers for incompetence.
With the cold offer to take them back as common laborers.
So what does that abruptness reveal? What's the structural incentive there?
Well, centralized bureaucratic funding provides stimulus, but it demands compliance and administrative control above all else, above creative autonomy.
So when funds are threatened or priorities change.
The institution demonstrates its power through these immediate high-visibility purges. It reinforces that the funding structure is precarious and conditional.
Okay, let's shift to the final incentive architecture we see in the sources. The propaganda feedback loop in war reporting.
The London Correspondent provides this really explicit anti-propagandist analysis within the source material itself. It's remarkable.
What does he say?
He notes that the Allied governments, having discovered that gloomy frankness is a spur, engage in a masterly job of anticipating the next German move.
So they're not just reporting facts, they're managing expectations.
Exactly. The institutional incentive for the government is maintaining morale and keeping people ready for anything. And that requires calculated, controlled releases of information designed to shape public reaction. It's pure narrative construction.
And where objective information is physically controlled, that construction becomes total.
Look at Paris after the German entry. The correspondent has to rely purely on oral information. No phone service, no papers.
That kind of acute information scarcity must amplify rumors.
It amplifies rumors and government-sanctioned narratives. The universally agreed-upon narrative that Paris would seem hateful suggests a sanitized consensus being formed in real time.
So the structural barrier, the physical control over the flow of information, created an environment where controlled narratives were inevitable.
It reminds you that the first priority of an institution in crisis is to control its own narrative to ensure its survival, not necessarily to ensure objective truth reaches the public.
So now we take that architecture and we hold it up as a mirror to our own time. What specific behavioral and systemic patterns from 1940 do you see structurally repeating in 2026?
Well, the most dangerous repetition, I think, is the mechanism of consuming crisis as entertainment and spectacle.
Right. In 1940, the wealthy elite consumed the era's deep suffering, the Dust Bowl, the poverty of the Depression as high art. They made misery aesthetically engaging.
They praised the film The Grapes of Wrath, which the magazine calls an epic of starvation, not for its social urgency, but for its technique.
The silhouettes, the stills, it looked like excerpts from a fine newsreel.
The artistic framing domesticated the trauma. The function of this is insulation. It transforms suffering into a highly produced, consumable narrative that allows you, the consumer, to engage with trauma and feel informed.
Without facing the necessity of difficult political action or genuine discomfort.
And this structural distance is maintained even for overt propaganda, like the German film Feldzug in Poland, Conquest of Poland. It's analyzed only for its moments of historical interest,
Positioning an aggressive war as a mere cinematic curio.
And in 2026, the structural repetition is just. It's unmistakable. We consume deep, systemic crises, climate fragmentation, political collapse, deep inequality as high-definition, engaging, highly produced content.
The aesthetic qualities, the narrative arcs, the quality of the storytelling often outweigh the urgency of the subject matter itself.
We engage with the story of the collapse, not the demand for structural change.
Even local excitement served this consumption function back then, the World's Fair exhibits.
Right. Even though they showcased modern technology like FM radio and nylon, they were primarily treated as spectacle. The source notes that the 20-story drop is just as exciting as ever at the parachute jump.
The institutional focus was on the thrill, the temporary, immediate excitement which distract from the deeper structural meaning of the technologies that were on display.
Okay, moving to the financial structure. We see the persistence of this vague financial anxiety. This is the second major structural repetition.
Where fear is generalized and personalized rather than focused on understanding systemic risk.
The indicators of deep market anxiety are clear in the 1940 archive. You see ads for estate administration services from Citibank Farmers Trust.
Suggesting widespread concern about wealth preservation.
And warnings in November 1940 that currency circulation has risen to an all-time high, and there is an insatiable demand for bidding money. That suggests a widespread generalized fear of inflation.
But despite that complexity, public anxiety is crystallized around really simple consumer-facing metrics.
The DeSoto is priced lower than last year. Aristides advertises a thrift parade with remarkable values. This dichotomy is the structural repetition. Extreme underlying complexity debt, systemic fragility, is buried in specialized language.
While public anxiety is channeled into the highly visible, accessible metrics of inflation and price competition.
In 2026, we worry obsessively about gas prices or housing costs, highly visible data points, while the underlying structural issues, like global debt instruments or proprietary trading algorithms, remain obscured by specialized language.
The system keeps anxiety actionable on a personal level. Can I afford this week's groceries?
Rather than on a systemic level, is the financial system itself viable?
There's a great anecdote about the bond check that captures this absurdity perfectly.
Oh, right. Someone is told their check for $2,500 worth of bonds wasn't able to carry 126 pounds.
They managed to turn high-stakes wartime finance buying war bonds into a funny, consumer-friendly story rooted in horse racing. The seriousness of investment is immediately diffused by a consumable, relatable context.
And that's the media's incentive. Package everything, even high finance, in anecdotal terms that reinforce the current cultural obsession, which leads directly to the third structural repetition, the tyranny of the immediate information cycle.
The 1940 radio listings are unbelievable. You have this institutionalized pundit class providing constant commentary.
Coltonborn, Hill, Lowell Thomas, Dorothy Thompson, Raymond Gramswing, often multiple times a day.
This creates an institutional demand for interpretation that often precedes or overwhelms factual reporting. The pundit becomes the primary, immediate filter for reality.
And the media's incentive to generate constant content, like the Sun's daily suggestion for diners out, right alongside their most complete guide to dining establishments, that mandates a structural focus on the ephemeral over the structural.
The content cycle must be fed every hour, every day.
And in 2026, the 2047 digital news cycle and social media structurally repeat this. The institutional need to provide constant analysis and takes ensures that we remain perpetually focused on the immediate transient event.
The Plymouth Convertible's new features, the latest political squabble.
Rather than the slow-moving foundational collapse happening outside the viewing frame. The structural logic is simple, and it protects the system. If the consumer is consuming commentary on the current crisis, they are not asking whether the institution providing the commentary is fundamentally reliable or whether it is biased by its own need for constant revenue generation and content turnover.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. We now need to analyze the elements that were presented in 1940 as temporary responses to a specific moment, like the war or the Depression.
But which fundamentally altered the institutional landscape forever.
So what's the first one that jumps out?
The most profound transformation is the institutionalization of perpetual crisis management and geopolitical engagement.
Yeah.
This permanently replaced American isolationism.
You can see that shift happening in the sources. The war starts as something happening over there. It requires complex travel advice.
Like assuring readers that Bermuda is still safe, that it's reachable by a short, safe trip by sea or by air, it's still framed by choice and luxury.
But by the summer of 1940, the conversation has completely shifted to the inevitability of engagement.
The British move from business as usual to embracing gloomy frankness marked an institutional break from peacetime norms that the U.S. very quickly mirrored.
For the U.S., this meant the rapid institutionalization of a war economy mindset, even before formal entry into the war.
The policy of isolation, a structural norm for over a century, was replaced by a structural assumption of perpetual global risk.
The source material mentions the debate around foreign policy direction with the title, A Navy Second to None.
And it's a detailed survey of naval trends since the 1850s, emphasizing that we must decide on a coherent foreign policy before we commit to this massive naval construction.
So the temporary urgency of wartime need, the requirement for getting ready for anything, by June 1940, it made the structural necessity of perpetual global power maintenance permanent.
The U.S. permanently took on the institutional role of global risk manager and military anchor. That was a massive strategic shift sold as a temporary necessity.
What's the second permanent change you see?
The normalization of highly processed goods. This fundamentally changed the consumer's expectation of consistency and the architecture of the supply chain.
Right. The ads are championing these technical industrial processes that are applied to simple agricultural products.
Take cigarettes. Pall Mall is praised for its additional length, which makes the smoke travel farther, and for bulking to mellow the tobacco.
Chesterfield boasts of being cooler and milder, which relies on industrial blending processes.
And the same logic is applied to food. Campbell's cream of mushroom soup is championed as being every bit as satin smooth and brimming as homemade.
It utilizes plump, snow-white high-house mushrooms and heavy cream. The institutionalized industrial process, Campbell's replaces traditional, localized labor and skill.
And this industrialization of consistency became the permanent baseline. Pabst Blue Ribbon proudly stated its blend of 33 separate brews, which guarantees a goodness that never varies.
Or Maggie's seasoning, an industrial aid that promised to bring out the best in foods, allowing chefs to skip complex seasonings and rely on a standardized product.
In 1940, these were new industrial marvels. By 2026, they are the absolute baseline expectation. The permanence lies in the consumer's assumption that complex, hidden industrial processes must deliver standardized, uniform, and nationally branded consistency.
And this expectation fundamentally eroded local food structures and made the global optimized supply chain essential and permanent.
And finally, the third one is the institutionalization of air travel,
which was marketed as this high-end luxury.
but was simultaneously building the foundations of mass global mobility. United Airlines offered luxurious overnight sleepers and daylight parlor planes, backed by 175 million miles of experience.
It was sold as a glamorous, unique event, something only the elite would ever use.
Yet the infrastructure being built and described, the highly trained pilots, the established routes, the main line, charted by U.S. government engineers, was fundamentally military and logistical in its necessity.
The temporary wartime need for speed, reliability, and precision made commercial air dominance inevitable.
Absolutely. The system transitioned air travel from a unique, glamorous event to a permanent, mundane, global logistical system. The massive technological and institutional investment made in 1940, while marketed as a luxury service, was repurposed in the post-war era to create the high-volume, global commercial infrastructure we depend on today.
The transient novelty became permanent structural reality.
Okay.
So let's try to find some actionable structural knowledge here. If 1940 is a stress test, what are the most critical institutional lessons that we can apply to 2026?
Lesson one for me is the incentive trap of critical thinking, which is rooted in systemic exhaustion.
The archive clearly illustrates the difficulty of critical engagement when institutional structures favor passivity, a passivity that's achieved through mental or physical drain.
We see this so explicitly in the anecdote of the man rescued at sea. He says, "I didn't know what he meant. I was that tired."
His physical and psychological exhaustion from the crisis makes understanding even simple policy or direction impossible.
And the London Correspondence reports just echo this survival fatigue. Sleep comes from complete exhaustion, which allows the constant repetition of that grim, normalizing phrase, "We shall get used to it."
So how can we structurally define the cost of that exhaustion in 2026? It's not just about lower productivity.
No. Fatigue itself is a structural inhibitor to reform. If institutional structures, whether it's optimized work schedules, gig economy instability, or a 247 media cycle optimized for distraction, if they maximize exhaustion, they limit the public's capacity for critical thinking and demanding structural change.
If resilience, your capacity to get used to it, is monetized,
Then your exhaustion serves the status quo. The system protects itself by making the effort required to challenge it too high a personal cost.
Okay, lesson two. This centers on the institutional value of the romantic nonconformist.
We looked at the political establishment's reaction to Wendell Willkie, the corporate magnate.
Right. They valued his sincere hankering for literary society and his youthful susceptibility to at least an intellectual interest in romantic examples of political nonconformism, like his interest in the socialist Norman Thomas.
And this intellectual posturing was entirely functional. It made him acceptable to a wide array of journalists and intellectuals like Dorothy Thompson and Mrs. Zerita Van Doren.
It sanitized him. It made a corporate power broker seem accessible and complex.
So the structural lesson is this. Institutional power uses personality to distract from its unyielding structural continuity. When a mainstream structure, be it political, corporate, or financial, elevates a figure based on their perceived outsider credentials, their charming nonconformity, or their intellectual depth,
It's a sign that the system is trying to co-opt the appearance of rebellion.
they elevate the charming exception to defend the rigid rule. Think of the modern tech CEO who critiques capitalism while monopolizing the market.
That's a powerful connection. All right, lesson three examines the danger of what you call self-symptomatic labor.
Right, where the worker's anxiety is focused on their lack of status or consumption rather than the structure of their exploitation.
We have two key examples in the text. First, the store manager in the small jerkwater town who complains about being forced to stay all winter.
Wishing for a city job where the movies change 3 times a week, his primary motivation is escapism and higher consumption, not community building or questioning the oppressive business model he's stuck in.
And then there's Walter the chauffeur.
Walter's internal frustration is that he receives only engraved tickets for his $30 check, and he's complaining that his new Buick sedan is okay for an owner but never meant for a chauffeur.
His frustration is rooted entirely in that gap between his perceived status driving a luxury car and the actual lack of status in his job.
In both cases, the workers are alienated. Their status is defined purely by their service-to-consumer whim. Institutions that structure labor this way create a workforce that is perpetually anxious and looking for escape, not stability.
The frustration is aimed horizontally at small comforts and status symbols, not vertically at the power structure that defines their precarity.
And the final lesson. Lesson 4 concerns the inadequacy of incrementalism in technology.
The media narratives of 1940 focused so heavily on these slight consumer improvements, and in doing so, they missed the exponential disruption entirely.
The Nash car ad boasted of the WWII for automatic heating and flash starting. The rotoshaver emphasized its 4 self-sharpening blades.
These were sold as major life-changing innovations in personal comfort.
But they're iterative consumer improvements, a 10% gain in comfort. Meanwhile, the RAF was flying, and the German war machine was perfecting logistics. The 1940 press only covered technology in terms of what makes current life slightly better. A smoother shave, sealed doors.
Distracting from the truly disruptive exponential shifts that were occurring simultaneously.
So the institutional failure here is the inability to distinguish between iterative consumer improvement and true exponential disruption. The focus on making the current life 10% better incentivizes reporting on the next smooth Buick, not the impending strategic reality that will render civilian consumer life temporarily 100% obsolete.
It's a systemic focus on near-term marketable comfort over long-term strategic viability.
So given those institutional incentives to preserve normalcy, sell advertising, maintain isolationism, what did the institutions of 1940 simply not have the conceptual framework to see? What were their blind spots?
The first major blind spot has to be the true scope of wartime atrocity and structural dehumanization. The report on German-occupied Poland is just chillingly detached.
It notes that the Poles are officially second-class citizens.
Right, they have to raise their hands to German authorities, use back doors for public buildings, and face a curfew at 8 o'clock. The violence is represented as cold regulation.
Risk injury if they ignore traffic signals, as there are not many automobiles but official boots.
That clinical detached reporting style, focusing on regulations and social degradation, it completely avoids the moral and physical totality of state-sponsored violence and genocide.
The institutional lens, which was focused on democratic norms and consumer rights, lacked the conceptual framework or the reporting incentive to capture sheer systemic dehumanization.
The coldness of the reporting is the blind spot. It's a necessary shield for the insulated American reader. The media framework simply cannot accommodate the concept of absolute moral and institutional collapse without undermining its entire mission of maintaining American normalcy and consumer confidence.
A second major blind spot was the unforeseen collapse of domestic and global supply chains.
The institutional system just assumed stability and integrity in regulation and distribution, even if the geopolitical situation changed.
You see these sudden shortages mentioned almost casually. Rare cognacs disappearing fast, with only a few bottles of Berry Brothers Category 3rd from 1875 remaining.
The entire luxury supply chain is on the verge of collapse, yet merchants are still advertising estate sales, operating as if the framework itself will endure.
And the discussion of Polish milk plants, specifying that Grade A and Grade B milk must be handled in entirely separate plants to prevent fraud.
It highlights an institutionalized, highly regulated system that is just assuming stability and integrity.
The institutions of 1940 could not foresee a world where global supply stops entirely, not just for luxury French goods, but for the basic industrial inputs needed for staples.
So the blind spot is failing to recognize that the global economy is not just a network of transactions, but a fragile physical system dependent on peace and global trust.
And when that trust breaks, the entire framework collapses. A concept that's completely incompatible with the institutional drive to sell product constancy, like Pabst Blue Ribbon's guaranteed uniformity across 33 different brews.
And
Finally, the institutions failed to conceptualize the long-term psychological cost of living under perpetual crisis or propaganda.
We see anxiety expressed in these oblique personal ways. The British mother in the air raid shelter who worries her grandson will be slightly queer because he was born during a bombardment.
Or Walter the chauffeur's girlfriend pulling away from him saying, "You don't think about anything but that," referring to his job anxieties.
The media environment, which was optimized for cheerfulness and fortitude and maintaining business as usual, had no framework to understand or address the long-term transgenerational psychic damage that results from constant low-level terror.
The institutional structure could not conceptualize a society that required therapeutic intervention for structural anxiety. That's a structure that, by 2026, is fully visible and institutionalized. They could only see individual worry, not systemic psychic failure.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our deep press analysis of 1940 showed us that the structures of that era were, well, they were magnificent at maintaining the illusion of normalcy.
They did it through a relentless, detailed focus on status and consumption, even when the underlying global foundations were completely crumbling.
So what does this all mean for you today?
The stress test shows that the real threat in 2026 isn't necessarily the complexity of the events themselves, the climate crisis, economic instability, but the institutional incentives that compel us to consume crisis as entertainment.
To filter structural failure through charismatic personality profiles, and to demand only incremental improvements to our comfort rather than questioning the viability of the entire system.
The challenge then and now is finding the incentive to look past the beautiful, expensive distraction. The Studebaker Land Cruiser, the latest smartphone, the charming political nonconformists.
And instead to examine the cold structural power dynamics behind the political and economic reality that shapes your world.
The New Yorker in 1940 celebrated the unconquerable spirit of those enduring the Blitz, their capacity to get used to it. If modern institutions are built on monetizing that same spirit, your capacity for infinite resilience and exhaustion, what price do we pay when our endurance is exploited as a permanent feature of a system that is no longer serving us? That's what you, the learner, should mull over.